On the morning of November the 6th, 1895, a young woman sat alone in a room in one of the grandest houses in Manhattan and wept. A footman had been posted outside her door. Not even her governess had been permitted to enter. She had been crying for so long that her face was swollen, and when the time came, her wedding would be delayed by 20 minutes while she composed herself enough to walk down the aisle. She was 18 years old. She was about to become the Duchess of Marlborough, the highest-ranking American woman in the British aristocracy. She was about to move to a palace in England and take her place in one of the oldest aristocratic lineages in the world and live a life that hundreds of millions of people in 1895 would have considered beyond imagination. And she did not want any of it. The woman who had arranged that morning was her mother. Alva Vanderbilt was, by the autumn of 1895, one of the most powerful social figures in America. She was the woman who had single-handedly forced New York's old money establishment to acknowledge the Vanderbilt name, who had built the most expensive private residence in the country, who had outmaneuvered every social rival she had ever encountered with a combination of tactical intelligence and absolute refusal to accept the word no as a final answer. She had climbed from near bankruptcy to the pinnacle of the Gilded Age in 20 years, and she had done it through a combination of strategic marriage, architectural ambition, and a talent for social manipulation that her contemporaries recognized even when they could not quite name it. She was also, in that same autumn, in the process of using her only daughter as the final and most consequential piece in a social campaign that had been running since before Consuelo was old enough to understand what was being decided on her behalf. This is a story about ambition so total and so consuming that it eventually devoured even the people the ambitious woman claimed to love most. It is a story about a particular world, the Gilded Age of the American 19th century, where the futures of women were the currency of a social economy that everyone participated in, and no one was supposed to name as such. It is a story about a transaction negotiated across drawing rooms and Newport cottages and the corridors of crumbling English palaces that exchanged one young woman's life for a title that meant everything to her mother and nothing to her. And it is, in the end, the story of a woman who eventually admitted what she had done, in a room before a Vatican investigator, in the plainest words available to her, and what that admission meant, or did not mean, about everything that had come before. To understand how that morning happened, you have to go back a long way. You have to start with a girl in Alabama who watched everything she had disappear and decided she would never allow that to happen again. Before we go any further, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. We genuinely love knowing who is joining us from where, and we read every single one. If you are new here, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one of these stories. Now, to understand Alva Vanderbilt, you have to start with where she came from and what the world took from her before she was old enough to fight back. Alva Erskine Smith was born on January the 17th, 1853, at 201 Government Street in Mobile, Alabama, into the kind of prosperous Southern family that understood, perhaps better than almost anyone, exactly how conditional prosperity could be. Her father, Murray Forbes Smith, was a cotton merchant and commission agent, originally from Virginia, a man of business connections and reasonable standing in the antebellum South. Her mother, Phoebe Ann Desha, came from political stock, the granddaughter of a United States congressman, and brought to the marriage a certain social confidence that Alva would inherit and then amplify to a degree her mother could never have anticipated. The family was well positioned, the kind of people who summered in Newport, Rhode Island when the weather turned hot in Mobile, and who took European vacations with the easy assumption that this was simply what families like theirs did. Alva was one of 5 surviving children. 2 sisters, Armida and Jenny, were her only siblings to reach adulthood. The years before the Civil War gave Alva something that would define her entire life: expensive taste supported by circumstances that would prove far less permanent than they appeared. She summered in Newport and learned the particular social grammar of that world, the way certain families occupied certain positions, and the way that position translated into ease and deference and a particular quality of attention from the people around you. She traveled in Europe and absorbed the visual language of another kind of grandeur entirely, the French kind, the kind built in stone over centuries and decorated with a precision and a richness that the American wealthy were only beginning to understand how to emulate. She was a Southern girl who had seen Newport in Paris before she was 10 years old, and she was being raised with expectations that the circumstances around her were quietly preparing to betray. In 1859, as sectional tensions made Mobile an increasingly uncertain place for a family with northern business connections, Murray Smith moved his household to New York City, where they settled briefly near Madison Square. When Murray's business required him to travel to Liverpool, England, Phoebe moved the family to Paris, and Alva was enrolled in a private boarding school in Neuilly-sur-Seine. She spent approximately 4 years there during the Civil War years, and what Paris gave her was not simply a facility with the French language or a familiarity with French social customs, though it gave her those things too. What Paris gave her was an aesthetic standard, a deep and abiding conviction about what beauty in architecture and interior design and social spectacle actually looked like when it was done properly. She absorbed it with the intensity of someone who was going to use it, and she spent the rest of her life doing exactly that. The family returned to New York after the war ended. What followed was swift and ruinous. Phoebe Smith died in 1871, when Alva was 18 years old. Murray's business ventures had by this point failed with a thoroughness that left nothing substantial behind. The fortune that had funded Paris schooling and Newport summers and European travel was gone. The social position that had made the Smith family feel like people of consequence in their world was revealed to have been dependent on money that no longer existed. 4 daughters needed to be established in life. There were no male relatives in a position to provide for them, and the world of 1871 offered women of Alva's background precisely one mechanism for financial recovery and social survival: a marriage to the right man. Alva understood this with absolute clarity, and she set about solving it without self-pity or sentimentality. She had been raised to expect a certain kind of life. That life had been taken from her at 18, simultaneously with her mother's death, and what she felt in response was not, by any available account of the period, an invitation to make peace with diminished circumstances. It was something closer to a grievance requiring correction. The world had given her expensive tastes, shown her what wealth and position actually looked like, and then removed the means to sustain them. She intended to get them back. At a party held for one of the Vanderbilt daughters, Alva's childhood friend Consuelo Iznaga, herself a strategically minded young woman from a family with Cuban roots and considerable social ambition, introduced her to William Kissam Vanderbilt. William was the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, who had built one of the greatest private fortunes in American history through railroads and shipping, and a willingness to outmaneuver rivals with a ferocity that made him legendary and feared in equal measure. William was charming and handsome and connected to money so substantial it operated in a different register from ordinary wealth entirely. Alva Smith understood immediately what she was looking at, and what she was looking at was the solution to the problem she had been carrying since her mother died. On April the 20th, 1875, Alva Smith became Alva Vanderbilt at Calvary Church in New York City, and she entered a marriage that came with a railroad fortune and a social obstacle she had not fully anticipated. The Vanderbilt wealth was beyond dispute, beyond even the kind of wealth most wealthy people had access to as a reference point. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had died in 1877, leaving an estate estimated at over $100 million, a sum that placed the family in a category essentially of their own in American life. His son, William Henry, had inherited the bulk of it, and William Kissam, Alva's husband, stood to inherit a very significant portion of that in turn. On the surface, the marriage solved everything that needed solving. What it did not solve, and what Alva quickly identified as the central problem of her social ambition, was the question of standing. New York's old money establishment, the families descended from Dutch patroons and colonial merchants who had held their positions for generations, had constructed a hierarchy of social access that was designed with considerable deliberateness to exclude the newly wealthy. It did not matter how much money you had, if you had made it recently and in the wrong industries, through commerce rather than inheritance, through industrial effort rather than accumulated land and name. The Vanderbilts, despite possessing more money than almost anyone in America, did not qualify. The arbiter of this hierarchy was a woman named Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor, who was known throughout New York society simply as Mrs. Astor, the definite article indicating that the title belonged to her alone. Each year, she threw a ball that was limited to the 400 people she considered the legitimate social elite of the city. The number was not entirely arbitrary. It was said to reflect the capacity of her ballroom, which held approximately 400 guests comfortably. The list was administered with the assistance of Ward McAllister, a Charleston-born socialite who had appointed himself the arbiter of social taste in New York and who had developed elaborate criteria for inclusion based on lineage, breeding, and what he considered appropriate comportment. The Vanderbilt family did not meet those criteria. The Commodore was regarded as too coarse, too aggressive in his methods, too recently arrived. His money was railroad money and shipping money, and whatever old New York thought of such money privately, it did not publicly embrace those who had made it. Alva treated this obstacle the way she treated every obstacle, as a problem with a solution that required finding. Her first move was architectural. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the foremost American architect of the era and the first American to graduate from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, to build a French chateau-style mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue. The construction ran from 1878 to 1882, occupying an entire city block between 51st and 52nd Street. Alva was involved in every decision of the project, with a hands-on intensity that was remarked upon repeatedly by those around her. A contemporary noted that she loved nothing better than to be knee-deep in mortar. The finished house, known as the Petit Chateau, announced the Vanderbilt presence on Fifth Avenue with a confidence that could not be ignored. It was not simply a residence. It was a declaration. The house was the stage. The party was the performance. To celebrate the completion of the mansion, Alva planned a costume ball that would function not merely as a social event, but as a carefully engineered operation to force Caroline Astor to acknowledge the Vanderbilts. 3 children had arrived during these years of construction and social maneuvering: Consuelo in 1877, William Cassam II in 1878, and Harold Sterling in 1884. The family was established. The house was finished. The press had been carefully cultivated over the years of the mansion's construction, and Alva was ready. The strategy worked through the simplest possible mechanism. Mrs. Astor had never formally called on the Vanderbilt home on Fifth Avenue to introduce herself, as the customs of New York society required a lady of her position to do when a new family of significance moved into the neighborhood. This omission gave Alva a technical justification she was fully prepared to exploit. She had no address for Mrs. Astor, she explained. Without a proper social call, she had no address to which she could send an invitation. The invitation, therefore, could not be dispatched. When Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, found that all of her friends had received their invitations, and hers had not arrived, the pressure on Mrs. Astor to act was social and immediate. If she wanted her daughter at the ball, she would have to call. She called. Her card was left at the Vanderbilt door. The invitation appeared the following morning. At 10 o'clock in the evening of March the 26th, 1883, carriages began arriving at 665th Avenue, and the crowds of onlookers held back by police pressed forward to catch whatever glimpse they could manage of the guests as they were escorted inside. Approximately 1,200 people attended. The Vanderbilts had spent something in the range of $250,000 on the event, with $65,000 going to champagne alone, $11,000 to flowers, and an extraordinary $156,000 to the costumes guests arrived wearing. The press had been invited to preview the mansion's decorations before the night of the ball itself, a publicity strategy so effective that the event had been the dominant topic of New York society conversation for weeks before it occurred. People had been practicing their assigned quadrilles for months. The costumes were extraordinary by any standard. Alva appeared as a Venetian princess in an underskirt of white and yellow brocade shading from deep orange to pale canary, a blue satin train embroidered in gold and lined with Roman red, a Venetian cap studded with magnificent jewels including a superb peacock rendered in colored gems. The room was spectacular, But the costume that generated the most sustained press attention belonged to Alva's sister-in-law, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, wife of Cornelius II, who arrived representing the electric light. Her white satin gown had been designed by the leading couturier Charles Frederick Worth, wired for electric current, studded with glass beads in a lightning bolt pattern, and fitted with a battery-powered torch that actually illuminated in her hand. It caused a sensation that lasted for days in the newspapers. Mrs. Astor came, attended alongside Ward McAllister, and was observed during the course of the evening in animated conversation with Alva. She conceded publicly, in remarks that were widely noted and repeated, that the time had come for the Vanderbilts, that the country had brought them forward, and there was no right to exclude them. The dancing continued until the sun rose over Fifth Avenue. Alva led the final Virginia reel as the sky began to lighten. Men in powdered wigs stumbled into the early morning to the bemusement of children making their way to school. The Vanderbilts had been admitted to New York's social establishment on Alva's terms, through Alva's planning, at Alva's pace. That same year, when she and other wealthy families found themselves unable to secure opera boxes at the Academy of Music, whose directors were resistant to admitting families of recently made fortune, Alva was among those who responded by founding the Metropolitan Opera, creating an institution where money, rather than bloodline, would determine access. When the existing structure refused her, she built a competing one. The Vanderbilts were in, and New York society said so, and the marriage that had made this conquest possible continued to come apart in ways that no amount of champagne and spectacle and social victory could address. 3 years after the costume ball, William Kissam Vanderbilt's father died and left his son $65 million, and Alva, who had never been particularly restrained in her ambitions for what money could accomplish, began to spend at a scale that had very little precedent in the history of American private life. The first major project was a yacht. She commissioned a vessel to be built at a cost of $500,000, which was named simply the Alva. At 285 feet in length, it was at the time of its completion the largest private yacht in the world, deliberately surpassing the vessel belonging to Mrs. Astor at 233 feet, and the Corsair belonging to J.P. Morgan at 165 feet. The Vanderbilts sailed the Caribbean and toured the Mediterranean aboard it in the company of friends and rivals and social aspirants, and the yacht served as a floating extension of everything Alva was constructing on land. Then she wanted a summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island. The social geography of Newport in the 1880s was shifting rapidly, from a relatively quiet resort of comfortable wooden houses to a theater of competitive opulence, and Alva intended to be at the center of that transformation. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt again, the same architect who had built the Petit Chateau, and what resulted was Marble House, constructed between 1888 and 1892, at a reported cost of $11 million in total, of which $7 million was spent on 500,000 cubic feet of marble imported from quarries around the world. White marble from Italy formed the exterior and the grand staircase. Pink Numidian marble from Algeria lined the dining room walls. The house was built on Bellevue Avenue, positioned deliberately and pointedly next door to Mrs. Astor's Beechwood estate, so that the contrast between the two properties would be impossible to overlook. The house required 36 servants to operate, including butlers, maids, coachmen, and footmen. Its kitchen employed a French chef at a salary of $10,000 per year, a figure that exceeded the annual income of most American households by a factor that did not bear close examination if you were inclined to discomfort. The Gold Room, which served as the mansion's grand salon, had every surface covered in 22-karat gold leaf and was described by those who saw it in the summer light as something close to incomprehensible in its accumulated richness. The library contained French architecture books and volumes on European history, original to the Vanderbilt family. The Gothic Room displayed Alva's collection of medieval and Renaissance decorative objects, assembled en bloc in Paris in the way that Gilded Age collectors understood was the fastest route to the appearance of centuries of cultural accumulation. Alva described Marble House in her memoirs as being like a fourth child to her. She was involved in every architectural and design decision, working alongside Hunt and then later with Hunt's sons after the elder Hunt's death, and her involvement earned her recognition as one of the first female members of the American Institute of Architects. The house was, in every meaningful sense, Alva-made physical. It was her will expressed in stone and gold and marble, imported at almost incomprehensible expense, positioned in the most fashionable resort in America, to be seen by everyone whose opinion she had spent 20 years trying to influence. What the house also contained, in a room on the second floor, was a bedroom belonging to her daughter Consuelo, which tells a different story about what Alva built and at what cost. Consuelo described the room in later years as austere and gloomy. Her mother had chosen every piece of furniture in it and had forbidden the intrusion of any personal possession that Consuelo might have introduced. In a house constructed to express Alva's dominion over the social world of Newport, Consuelo's bedroom expressed Alva's dominion over her daughter. The two things were not constructed differently. They were the product of the same instinct applied at different scales. Marble House was finished in 1892, and it was everything Alva said it would be. And within 3 years, the marriage that had paid for it was over, and something worse was beginning. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on March the 2nd, 1877, the only daughter of William and Alva, and from the earliest years of her childhood, it was clear that her mother had constructed a specific future for her that had been decided before Consuelo was old enough to have any preference in the matter. She was educated at home by a succession of governesses and tutors rather than in schools. Under a regime that Alva supervised with the same exhaustive personal attention she brought to her architectural projects. By the age of 8, Consuelo was required to recite poems in English, French, and German every Saturday, all 3 languages having been drilled into her through daily instruction. By 18, she had passed the entrance examinations for both Oxford and Cambridge, a fact that said something significant about the quality of the education that had been arranged for her, and rather less about the uses to which that education would be permitted to be put. The posture requirement was not a figure of speech. Alva had a steel rod constructed specifically for her daughter, a device that ran down the length of Consuelo's spine and fastened at the waist and over the shoulders. Consuelo was required to wear it during her lessons. The construction of the rod made it nearly impossible to write comfortably and forced her to hold her reading material at an elevated angle. It was not worn occasionally or as a temporary measure, but regularly, as a standard feature of the educational day. For any infraction, however minor in nature, Consuelo was whipped with a riding crop. When she reached adolescence and dared to express a preference about the clothing her mother had selected for her, Alva's response was delivered without apparent consideration. "I do the thinking. You do as you are told." Consuelo described herself in later years, writing from the distance of old age, as having seen herself through her mother's eyes as one of her projects. She described herself as an individual who had been denied the right to her own will or opinions, someone who had functioned in her mother's world as a pawn to be positioned according to a strategy that had been developed without her consultation. The space of her bedroom at Marble House, she wrote, felt like her mother's space rather than her own. She was not unhappy in the way of a neglected child. She was unhappy in the way of a person whose identity had been determined in advance of her having formed one, whose preferences were acknowledged only when they coincided with what had already been decided. The name she had been given carried its own instruction. Consuelo had been named for Alva's best friend from childhood, Consuelo Iznaga, a half-Cuban, half-American socialite who in 1876 had married George Montague, Viscount Mandeville, later the 8th Duke of Manchester. Iznaga had been among the first American women of her generation to make the transatlantic trade explicit, crossing to England with American money and returning in social terms with an English title. Alva had watched this transaction from close range. Her daughter, named for the woman who had accomplished it, was being prepared from childhood to replicate it at a higher level of the English aristocratic hierarchy. The name was both a tribute and a blueprint. Alva began turning down proposals for Consuelo's hand from the time her daughter became eligible. At least 5 offers were declined as insufficient. The target she identified during a family trip to England in 1893 was Charles Spencer Churchill, who had become the 9th Duke of Marlborough the previous year upon inheriting the dukedom, Blenheim Palace, and a weight of debt that had been accumulating across the Marlborough estate for a generation. Alva met his aunt and uncle, Lord and Lady Lansdowne, on that trip, and she understood the contours of the situation immediately. The Duke needed money. He possessed one of the oldest and most prestigious titles in England. The transaction that might result from connecting these two facts to the Vanderbilt fortune was exactly what Alva had been planning since she named her daughter after Consuelo Iznaga. Consuelo made her European debut in 1894 at 17. She was described by everyone who encountered her as unusually beautiful, with a face of arresting and distinctive character, a long and slender neck, enormous dark eyes fringed with curling lashes, and a manner that combined natural intelligence with the particular grace that had been trained into her since childhood by the relentless regime her mother had imposed. At 18, by any measure, she was remarkable. She was also, by any measure, the primary instrument of a plan she had not been asked to ratify. By the summer of 1895, Alva had identified her candidate, engineered a series of introductions, and begun generating the social momentum of an engagement that she considered already arranged in its essential form, not yet knowing that her daughter had quietly and urgently made a different choice. In March of 1895, Alva Vanderbilt did something that no woman of her position in New York society had done in living memory. She filed for divorce from her husband. The grounds she cited were William's adultery, a long-running pattern of infidelity that she had endured for years and could no longer accept. The specific affair that appears to have finally broken whatever remained of the marriage was one whose alleged details carried a particular cruelty. Rumor, persistent and detailed enough that it was treated as credible by people who knew the family, held that William had taken as a lover Consuelo Iznaga, Alva's oldest and closest friend, the woman for whom Alva had named her daughter. Whether accurate in its particulars or not, the story had a biographical logic that did not require verification to sting. The woman who had introduced Alva to William, who had served as the living model for the kind of transatlantic social ascent Alva was engineering for her daughter, had become, in this version of events, the final instrument of the marriage's destruction. The social consequences of the divorce arrived immediately. Divorce at this level of New York society was essentially without precedent. Women of Alva's position endured their marriages, or managed them, or ignored the aspects that were unendurable, because the social contract of the Gilded Age required this of them. A woman who filed for divorce, regardless of what her husband had done, had violated that contract in a way that the establishment did not easily forgive. Alva found herself socially isolated in a manner that recalled, in its practical effect, the exclusion she had experienced as a Vanderbilt wife in the years before the costume ball. She had spent 20 years fighting her way in, and a single legal document had placed her outside again. The financial terms of the settlement were generous. Alva received more than $10 million, retained custody of all 3 children, and kept outright ownership of Marlborough House and several other properties. She was not ruined in any material sense. She was, however, in a social position that required a solution, and the solution she identified was the one she had already been building toward. The scholar Amanda Mackenzie Stewart, whose dual biography of Alva and Consuelo remains the most thorough examination of this period, has argued that the timing of the Marlborough arrangement was not coincidental with the divorce. The same year in which Alva's social standing was most vulnerable was the year in which she pressed hardest for Consuelo's marriage to the Duke. Having a duchess for a daughter would provide a social restoration that no amount of money alone could purchase, and that no American rival could match or diminish regardless of their own standing. The mother of a duchess occupied a position above the reach of any domestic social critic. Whatever the precise weighting of her motivations, maternal calculation, genuine belief in the superiority of the arrangement, or the acute self-interest of a woman managing her own social survival in real time, the machinery of the Marlborough engagement accelerated through the spring and summer of 1895 with the same relentless momentum Alva had always brought to campaigns she had decided to win. The Duke arrived at Newport as Alva's guest in the summer of 1895. She threw a ball in his honor. She arranged the circumstances under which he and Consuelo would be in each other's company repeatedly and publicly. The financial terms were being negotiated simultaneously in the background. $2.5 million in Vanderbilt Railroad stock to the Duke as a marriage settlement, plus an annual allowance of $100,000 for the Duke and his future wife. The Duke gave up an Englishwoman he had been in love with and accepted the terms. He had inherited Blenheim Palace and its crippling obligations. He would later tell Consuelo on their honeymoon that he had married her because he felt obliged to save it. What Alva did not know, or knew and had determined to treat as a logistical problem rather than a moral one, was that Consuelo had already made a different decision entirely. Winthrop Rutherford was everything Alva had spent 20 years trying to climb beyond, and in precisely the right ways to make him irrelevant to her plans. He was American, not English. He was old New York rather than new title. He was 30 years old in 1895, descended through his father from Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch Director General of the colony that became New York, and from John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts, two of the founding names of American history. He was a member of the 400. He was handsome and well-regarded and socially irreproachable in every dimension that mattered to New York society. Edith Wharton, who had known him since childhood and regarded him with a combination of admiration and the particular attentiveness of someone studying the material for fiction, described him as the prototype of the ideal male figures of her early novels, the embodiment of everything old New York found most desirable in a man of its own class. He had no title. For Alva, that disqualified him entirely, as no amount of breeding or personal quality could compensate for the absence of the one thing she had decided her daughter was going to acquire. The wit of one society observer captured the situation with a precision that was not unkind. Winty was outclassed. 6'2" in his golf stockings, he was no match for 5'6" in a coronet. The secret engagement between Consuelo and Winthrop had formed the day before Consuelo left for a European trip, a brief and urgent compact between two young people who understood they were running out of time. They had managed to meet despite Alva's attempts to keep them apart, to confirm between themselves that what they felt was real and that they intended to honor it. Consuelo returned from Europe to find her mother's campaign for the Duke operating at full capacity, the press already beginning to speculate about an engagement, the social machinery grinding toward a conclusion that had been decided for her. She confronted Alva directly. She told her mother, in words she later described as the bravest she had ever spoken, that she considered she had the right to choose her own husband. The phrase was a simple statement of a principle so basic that it required no argument. It brought down, as Consuelo described it, a frightful storm. What followed was an escalation through stages, each more extreme than the last, that tells you a great deal about the woman Alva Vanderbilt was, and about the lengths to which she was prepared to go when her objectives were threatened. She began with cajoling, persuasion, the laying out of all the reasons why the Duke was a superior choice and Rutherford an insufficient one. When that produced no change in Consuelo's position, she moved to ordering. The flat declaration that the Duke was whom Consuelo would marry, and that the matter was settled. When Consuelo continued to resist and threatened to elope with Rutherford, Alva locked her in her room. She threatened to have Rutherford killed. Consuelo still refused. Then Alva took to her bed. The message delivered by Consuelo's aunt with the gravity appropriate to a near-fatal pronouncement was that Alva was gravely ill, that her health was being irretrievably undermined by Consuelo's stubbornness, that she was at death's door, and that another shock of the kind Consuelo's resistance represented might prove final. The implication was unavoidable. If Consuelo persisted, her mother would die, and Consuelo would bear the weight of that death for the rest of her life. The illness was, in the assessment of those who examined it afterward, either faked entirely or dramatically exaggerated for strategic effect. What it was not was medically genuine, as Alva's recovery, once Consuelo capitulated, was rapid and complete. Consuelo broke the engagement with Rutherford. She accepted the Duke. Alva rose from her sickbed, and within days she was feeding details of her daughter's trousseau to the press, including the gold fastenings on Consuelo's undergarments, which were published in Vogue. She was the mother of a future duchess, and she managed the publicity of that fact with the same skilled attention she had brought to every other public campaign of her life. On the morning of November the 6th, 1895, a footman was posted outside Consuelo's door in the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue. Not her governess, not her maid, not any familiar face. She dressed herself, as she later wrote, like an automaton in the lovely lingerie with its real lace and the white silk stockings and shoes. She felt cold and numb when she went downstairs to meet her father, who had been permitted by Alva to attend the ceremony for the sake of appearances, but would be required to leave immediately after. The wedding at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue was delayed 20 minutes because Consuelo had been crying so long that her face was too swollen to be seen in public. She walked down the aisle behind her veil, which covered what was plainly obvious to those present in the church. Some of the crowd that had gathered outside to glimpse the bride, numbering in the hundreds and requiring a police presence to manage, must have sensed something was wrong when they finally saw her. The ones watching closely almost certainly did. On their honeymoon, the Duke told Consuelo plainly that he had married her because he felt obliged to save Blenheim Palace. That sentence, delivered by a man to his new wife within days of their wedding, is one of the more honest statements anyone in this story ever made. It was the truth of the transaction, stated without ornament. Alva had accomplished exactly what she set out to accomplish, at precisely the cost it required, and the cost was paid entirely by someone else. Consuelo Vanderbilt crossed the Atlantic as a duchess and arrived at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, and the life that opened before her was, by every external measurement, the fulfillment of everything her mother had promised. Blenheim was enormous and ancient, a palace of over 300 rooms built to honor the first Duke of Marlborough's military victories. Surrounded by parkland designed by Capability Brown, filled with portraits of Spencer Churchill ancestors who had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the lineage she had been purchased to continue. It was also cold and damp and insular. Its social customs formed over generations in ways that regarded her American origins as a permanent and not entirely forgivable deviation from what the aristocracy considered appropriate in a duchess. The public version of Consuelo's life in England was, by most measures, a genuine success. She was widely admired by the aristocracy and by the English public, praised for her beauty and her intelligence and the seriousness with which she approached the charitable and social obligations of her position. The playwright James Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan, stated that he would stand all day in the street simply to see Consuelo Marlborough get into her carriage. Oxford undergraduates described being struck by her face, her enormous dark eyes, her long neck, the quality of her smile. She involved herself in social causes, in the welfare of people on the Marlborough estate and in the surrounding communities, and eventually in the women's suffrage movement in England. She was, in the public world she inhabited, a figure of genuine grace and consequence. The private world was a different country. 2 sons were born, John Albert in 1897, who was made godson to the future King Edward VII, and who would in time become the 10th Duke of Marlborough, and Lord Iver in 1898. The marriage that had produced them was loveless from the beginning, and grew progressively more remote as the years accumulated. Several years into the marriage, Consuelo reconnected with Winthrop Rutherford while traveling in Europe. She spent time with him in Paris. She confessed to her husband that she still loved Rutherford and wished to leave with him. Rutherford refused her. He would not be the instrument of the public scandal that her departure from Marlborough would have required. She returned to Blenheim. Questions arose later through the remarks of the Duke's second wife about the parentage of Lord Ivor, questions that were never conclusively answered, and that add a further layer of ambiguity to what was already a story with very few clean lines. The couple separated formally in 1906, 11 years after the wedding at St. Thomas Church. The Duke put his experience of the marriage plainly when he reflected that life together had not brought them closer, and that time had only sharpened the incompatibilities between 2 people of fundamentally different temperament who had been condemned to share a life they had not chosen together. The divorce was finalized in 1921. The Vatican granted an annulment in 1926, while Consuelo navigated the distance between the life the world saw and the life she was actually living. Her mother was occupied with the next campaign, which turned out to be the one that would ultimately define how history would know her. On January the 11th, 1896, less than 3 months after her daughter's wedding, Alva married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont in a civil ceremony conducted by the mayor of New York City. And the quality of contentment that settled over the years that followed was something genuinely new in her life. Oliver was the son of August Belmont, the prominent banker who managed American interests for the Rothschild financial dynasty, and Carolyn Perry, the daughter of Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry, the naval officer who had opened Japan to American commercial contact. He had been a friend of the Vanderbilts since the late 1880s, a companion on yacht voyages, a neighbor on Bellevue Avenue in Newport. Those who knew both of them concluded from various signs that he had been in love with Alva since at least 1889, a feeling that had been visible to observers before it was acknowledged in any official form. What Oliver offered that William had never provided was companionship without campaign. They traveled together with genuine pleasure rather than social purpose. They gardened. They entertained in Newport with the relaxed extravagance of people who enjoyed each other's company, rather than people performing for a social audience that needed managing. Alva renovated Oliver's 60-room Newport mansion, Belcourt, with characteristic thoroughness because she could not engage with a property without reshaping it. She also oversaw the construction of a new Manhattan townhouse, but the building projects of the Belmont years were expressions of taste rather than instruments of social warfare. She had, in some meaningful sense, arrived at what she had spent 20 years working toward, and she found that she could inhabit it. Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont died suddenly in 1908 of peritonitis following an appendectomy. He was 49 years old. The death was swift and unexpected, and Alva, at 55, found herself in the particular position of a woman who had spent her entire adult life in motion, suddenly without the central relationship that had given the motion its context. She left for Europe while Oliver's estate was settled, and she stayed abroad long enough to understand that she was going to need to find a new purpose that was not simply an extension of the old ones. What she found changed the historical record of who she was. A lecture by the suffragist Ida Husted Harper and an invitation to attend the International Suffrage Alliance Conference in London in 1909 were the practical catalysts for what became the most consequential work of Alva's remaining decades. In London, she encountered Emmeline Pankhurst and the Women's Social and Political Union, whose strategy for advancing the suffrage cause was built on deliberate provocation, on newsworthy and shocking public behavior, designed to make the political cost of ignoring women's demands greater than the political cost of addressing them. Alva recognized this strategy immediately and completely. She had been practicing it her entire life in drawing rooms and newspaper columns and the social machinery of Newport. The tactics were the same. The objective was considerably more important. She returned to America and moved at her characteristic pace. She founded the Political Equality Association in 1909 and rented an entire floor of a Fifth Avenue office building as organizational headquarters for the suffrage movement in New York. When 18,000 garment workers went on strike in November of 1909, she supported their cause publicly and financially, raising money for the strike fund and renting the Hippodrome in Midtown Manhattan for a pro-strike rally that drew enormous crowds. She wrote articles for newspapers. She organized, funded, and attended suffrage meetings throughout New York State and eventually across the country. In 1913, she arranged for Emmeline Pankhurst to come to America for a speaking tour. When immigration officials at Ellis Island detained Pankhurst on arrival, fearing that her militant methods would be imported along with her, Alva hired lawyers and applied every form of political and social pressure available to her, until Pankhurst was released after 2.5 days in detention. Alva later quoted Pankhurst's description of the difference between American and English suffragists with evident approval. With the Americans, suffrage was still an ethical principle, and with the English, it was a political one. The Americans talked, the English acted. Alva had no interest in being categorized among those who merely talked. By 1916, she had co-founded the National Woman's Party, and at the Chicago convention that launched it, she pledged $500,000 to the new organization, a sum that was described at the time as the largest individual political campaign pledge ever made by anyone in American history. In January of 1917, she organized the first picket line ever to be mounted at the White House, an act of confrontational directness that brought the suffrage campaign into visible conflict with the federal government in a way that no amount of polite petitioning had managed to achieve. She was 63 years old, and she showed, by every available account of those who were with her, no sign whatsoever of slowing down. There was an irony buried in Alva's suffrage work that she either did not articulate publicly or chose not to examine in any statement that has survived, and it was this. When Consuelo had married the ninth Duke of Marlborough and moved to England, she had, under the law of the United States as it stood at the time, lost her American citizenship. The law held that an American woman who married a foreign national took on her husband's nationality and surrendered her own. Among the international campaigns that Alva directed through organizations like the Pan American Union was a sustained effort to secure treaty recognition of equal nationality rights, confirming that marriage could have no impact on the citizenship of American women. She pursued this objective until her death, and it was honored after her death in legislation that bore its consequences. The law that should have protected Consuelo in 1895 was one of the things Alva spent her final decades fighting to create. She never said this plainly. It was visible anyway to anyone who knew both stories. In 1921, 26 years after the wedding, at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, the ninth Duke of Marlborough began proceedings to have the marriage annulled by the Vatican. His motivation was primarily his conversion to Roman Catholicism, a faith that did not recognize divorce, and he needed the annulment to allow him to remarry within the church. Consuelo consented to the proceedings, and Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, the woman who had engineered the entire arrangement in the first place, who had locked her daughter in a room and threatened a young man's life and faked a mortal illness to ensure the wedding happened, went before a Vatican investigator and told the truth. She stated that she had forced her daughter to marry the Duke. She stated that she had always had absolute power over her daughter. The Vatican granted the annulment in August of 1926. It is worth considering what that testimony actually was. Alva was not confessing in a moment of unguarded grief or late-life remorse separated from her characteristic calculations. She was making a legal statement in service of a practical objective that she wanted achieved, namely her daughter's freedom from a marriage that had been a misery from its beginning. But the words she used were plain and they were public, and they stood in the permanent record of a Vatican legal proceeding. A woman who had spent her entire life controlling what other people were permitted to know about her had gone before an official investigator and stated, without qualification, what she had done. Whether this constituted accountability or simply another deployment of the truth at a moment when the truth was the most useful instrument available is not a question that has a clean answer. Both things were probably true simultaneously, which was true of most of the things Alva did. The annulment was granted. Consuelo married Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and heir to a textile fortune, a man who had been in love with her since her debutante days and who, by every account that survives of their life together, brought her the kind of happiness that the Marlborough years had never approached. Alva moved to France, purchasing a chateau at Augerville, in the French countryside not far from her daughter's home. The woman who had once been Consuelo's jailer became, in the final chapter of both their lives, her neighbor and companion. What Consuelo felt about this proximity, about the woman who had arranged her misery, now living down the road, is something her memoir, published in 1953 under the title The Glitter and the Gold, addresses with a care and a restraint that speaks to the complexity of what had happened between them. The book neither condemns nor fully forgives. It is the book of a woman who had arrived at something like peace with something that had not been peaceful, without pretending that something was not there. In the last decade of her life, Alva was living between Paris, the French Riviera, and the chateau at Augerville, still directing the National Woman's Party from abroad, still funding campaigns, still attending to the international work of securing equal rights through the slow machinery of treaties and diplomatic conventions. She had been president of the National Woman's Party since 1921, and she held the position by the terms of her own determination until her death. In 1929, when the party's existing Washington headquarters was threatened, she purchased a large historic building on Capitol Hill and donated it outright to the National Woman's Party, giving them a permanent home within walking distance of the legislative body they had spent years trying to change. That building stands today as the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, designated as such by President Barack Obama in 2016, named jointly for Alva Belmont and Alice Paul in recognition of what they had built together. In the spring of 1932, Alva suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. She continued working from France as best she could manage. She died in Paris on January the 26th, 1933, of bronchial and heart ailments. She was 79 years old. She left $100,000 to the National Woman's Party in her will, along with instructions for her funeral that were as deliberate and carefully planned as everything else she had ever organized. The funeral was held at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in New York City, the same building where Consuelo had married the 9th Duke of Marlborough 38 years before. Approximately 1,500 people attended. Every one of the pallbearers was a woman. Alva had specified this in her instructions, and it was honored exactly as she had directed. Her coffin was draped with a suffrage picket banner carrying the words, "Failure is impossible." She is buried beside Oliver Belmont in the Belmont Mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, in a mausoleum that features painted glass windows designed by the artist Helen Maitland Armstrong, Renaissance-inspired and formal and permanent, the way Alva preferred things. 17 months after her burial, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Equal Nationality Act, confirming that no American woman would lose her citizenship by marrying a foreign national. And the law that should have protected Consuelo in 1895 was finally, after decades of campaigning and decades of consequences for those who had lived without its protection, part of the legal record of the United States. Marble House still stands on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island. The Preservation Society of Newport County purchased it in 1963 with funds provided by Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, Alva and William's youngest son, who was nearly 80 years old at the time of the purchase. Visitors walk through the gold room and the Gothic room and the dining room with its pink Numidian marble, and many of them have no particular awareness of what the house cost, in the currency that does not appear on any financial ledger, but that was paid nonetheless, in full, by a young woman whose possessions were not permitted in her own bedroom. Blenheim Palace still stands in Oxfordshire, England, maintained in part by the wealth that arrived with the young woman weeping behind her veil at St. Thomas Church in 1895. The Vanderbilt money saved Blenheim and restored what the debts of the 9th Duke's inheritance had been consuming. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan died on December the 6th, 1964, in Southampton, New York, at age 87. She was buried in the churchyard at St. Martin's in Bladon, Oxfordshire, beside her younger son, Lord Ivor Spencer Churchill, not far from the palace her mother's fortune had saved and her own life had paid for. Her memoir is still in print. There is a version of Alva Vanderbilt that history has placed in the secondary ledger, less prominent than it deserves to be. The suffragist who organized the first White House picket line, who funded the campaign that helped secure the 19th Amendment, who pledged $500,000 to women's political equality at a moment when such a pledge required genuine audacity, who died with a banner reading, "Failure is impossible." Draped across her coffin at a funeral run entirely by women in a church in New York City. That woman was real. Her work was consequential and lasting. The monument on Capitol Hill bearing her name is evidence that the federal government eventually agreed. And there is the other version, which has proven harder to set aside. The mother who constructed a steel rod for her daughter's spine, who locked her child in a room, who threatened to have a young man killed for the crime of being loved, who performed a mortal illness on her sickbed until her daughter surrendered the life she had chosen, who arranged a transaction in railroad stock and aristocratic title and then watched from Newport as the transaction closed and called it a success. Both women were the same woman. The transaction she made in 1895 was not the whole of who she was. It was not even close to the whole of what she did with her 8 decades on Earth. But it was the thing she eventually had to admit out loud in a formal proceeding before a person with the authority to record it. She forced her daughter to marry the Duke. She had always had absolute power over her daughter. She said this, "It is in the record." What the Gilded Age actually was, beneath the marble and the gold leaf and the 1,200 guests arriving by carriage on a March night in 1883, was a world in which the futures of women functioned as the currency of a social economy that everyone participated in and that no one was supposed to name. Alva understood this economy better than almost anyone of her generation because she had encountered it from both directions, as the young woman who had to marry to survive, and as the powerful woman who turned her daughter into the commodity she herself had once been forced to become. She eventually named it, under oath, in the plainest words she had available. She said what she had done. The admission changes nothing about what happened on the morning of November the 6th, 1895, in a room with a footman at the door. It changes something about the woman who put the footman there, and about what she understood in the end, and perhaps about the particular cost of spending a lifetime refusing to accept the word no, even when the person saying it was your own child. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories like this one.